Without further ado, this is Dennis Hetzel. He is here today to talk to us about search for birth parents. So without further ado, go ahead and get started, Dennis.
Well, thanks a lot, Ashley. And this is really crazy for me because I'm seeing the names of everybody, and there's like somebody from every part of my life, from childhood in Chicago to, today in North Carolina where I live. And for those of you who I don't know, thanks so much for joining. We are going to talk about my search for my birth parents. And, one of the cliches, word cliches we hear all the time is my truth, and it's being used so much it's sort of become a cliche, but this really is about my truth. It's part of my story, and it's kind of goes without saying why an adoptee might want to find out the story of his birth parents. And I found I got more into it as I got older and I had children of my own because it's part of their story too. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully I came up with a few things that will help some of you that are doing your own genealogical research. And you'll find this kind of interesting and meaningful and even spiritual in some respects. And I'll be talking more about that. I do want to thank, before I get into the guts of the program and the slide deck, thank Kathy Tietz and Ashley at Headline Books. Those are my publishers. And we're not going to be talking much today about my books, but in the spirit of shameless self-promotion, note the sign behind me. And at the end of the program, we'll talk about some ways to purchase my books, including free shipping, personalized, if you go to the Headline Books website at headlinebooks.com and search on my name, because that is also why we're here. My two novels are political thrillers, really with some sports thrown in, tied to my own boyhood in Chicago and the fact that I'm a political nerd and a political junkie. And the third book, which will be out later this year or early next with Headline Books, is called The Vanished, and it's very different. It's a thriller about a young journalist who disappears while she tries to investigate an object that lands on the high school football field in the beach town in North Carolina where she grew up. So I will ask you respectfully, if you're interested in my books, to check them out. So the sales pitch aside, let's talk about my story. So I just need to take a second here to get my deck going, and then we will take it from there. And as Ashley said, if you have questions and you're in Zoom, just go ahead and type them in, and we'll try to leave time for as many questions as we can before we finish. And if you're on Facebook Live watching this, you can type questions into Facebook, and we'll also try to get to those. If we run out of time, I'm happy to go offline. And one of the things that you learn when you go through this as an adoptee is it's like this universe of people who all kind of totally understand why you're here and why you're doing this, including I know some people that are on this presentation. And we help each other, when we go down blind alleys and have things that might be fruitful, we help each other. And I am more than happy to talk to people offline about their own search, or in some cases, I've talked to people who, they have, the other day I heard from someone say, well, I got two sons, they're both adopted. One seems interested, one seems not interested at all. And I kind of laugh because when I hear the not interested at all thing, 9 times out of 10, it's a guy, because guys build up scaffolding around their feelings, I think, a lot more than women do. And I certainly did that. But again, I'm happy to help people. So without further ado, let's get going. This is me. This is my adoption certificate. I was adopted, my parents, Paul and Ruth Hetzel, who will always be my parents, the parents who raised me. And I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that as I'm talking about the search for the birth parents. July 22nd, 1952 is my birth date in Chicago. And you'll see how all kinds of things tie back to these ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago. And this is me too. This is my original birth certificate. The law changed in Illinois in recent years. New York is the most recent, that allows adoptees of a certain age to see their original birth certificates. And by the time I saw this, I knew a lot of what was in there. I wasn't really terribly surprised by anything, but it certainly confirmed a lot of things I thought I knew at that point. And I circled you can see the birth certificate number, because it's the same exact number as the birth certificate I just showed you on the previous slide. A couple things struck me though when I did see it. It still was kind of funny, to see my birth mother's name on that, and she made up the name of the birth father. John Dargan is not my birth father. This was not unusual. I was doing a presentation related to one of my novels a couple years ago, where the moderator, I happened to mention this in passing. Then I think she asked me what my next book might be, and I'm still trying to decide if I want to do a book about this. And she said, you need to read The Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler. And it's a book that, if you're not an adoptee or have ever given up a child for adoption, it will make you cry. It will make you humble. It will make you sad. It's about what happened basically to unwed moms in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, and how they were treated generally. In some cases, and Marguerite, my birth mother, described this to one of my cousins who I found later, that she wanted to hold the baby, but it was pretty much snatched out of her arms. And there's just story after story like that, anecdotes about the women were shamed often even by their own families. And then just we're told, well, just get on with your life. Like giving up a baby was like donating clothes to Goodwill or something. And of course, as you know, I can only imagine not being a woman or a mother, but I can imagine a little bit how that must have felt, almost a PTSD type of situation. As you hear Marguerite's story in a few more minutes, I think she would have fit right into Ann Fessler's book. And from what I've learned about Marguerite, I think she would have probably been a willing participant and perhaps, found some peace in talking about it. So it's a book I highly recommend. And so let's continue the journey. These are my parents. This is Ruth and Paul Hetzel. They met in Baltimore during World War II, where my dad was stationed before he went overseas. He won the Bronze Star. He saw a lot of action in the Philippines and in Burma. He was a vending machine repairman, among other things. And in his obituary, I told a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, he could fix more things with a paper clip than most people could fix with a toolbox. And in another life, he probably would have become an engineer as opposed to having about a 7th grade education. And after they got married, they moved back to Chicago, where my dad was born in 1908, the last year the Cubs won a World Series before they won one again in 2016, which will resonate to those of you who've read my books. And they lived in the ethnic Hungarian neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, where he grew up, and where I lived until I was about 5. And he was already in his 40s when I was adopted, and my mom was 10 years younger. My mom could not have children, so that's one reason they were interested in adoption. And one of the fascinating things about it, at least to me, is this ethnic west side of Chicago, as I'm sure some of you know, is just an ethnic melting pot of Eastern and Central Europeans. And I have absolutely no doubt, from what I know now, that paths cross, that they probably walked down the street past members of my birth parents' family on both sides, as you'll learn more. It's amazing. And it was the neighborhood we lived in on Carroll Avenue was all Hungarians for the most part. I remember a corner grocery store, even though I was very little. My mom sang in the choir in Hungarian, even though she didn't speak Hungarian. That's my dad during World War II with my grandmother. They lived in the back of the house. My Aunt Ethel and Uncle Ed lived upstairs, and we lived downstairs. So, again, it's, kind of your classic stereotypical urban melting pot neighborhoods. And I often just think about how the paths must have crossed, and little did they know. One of the links that I've discovered in recent years in more detail involved Dr. Delson. Betty Delson was a very accomplished woman for any time, but certainly for the early 50s. She was a physician who was born in Latvia and came over as a young woman. Her husband Herman was an attorney, And she is the link between certainly my birth mother's family and my adoption. There's no question about that. And they always took a lot of interest in me. Herman and Betty Delson sent us Christmas cards every year until they passed. I was really thankful that Debbie Pine, a woman in Chicago who read an article I wrote for the Chicago Tribune about this, that really emphasized what I just talked about regarding Ann Fessler's book and the girls who went away. So that really resonated her, and that Dr. Delson, who would have been her great aunt, generally cared and held things close to her chest. And I suspect Herman handled the adoption. I have a note I found actually the other day when I was preparing for this, in which my mom, Ruth, told me at some point that they got onto Dr. Delson related to a woman that was a coworker of my mom's at Sears, or Aunt Ethel. My Aunt Ethel, that's my Uncle Ed in that picture, her husband, may well have been, the glue that got everything together. What we do know to a pretty close certainty is that after Marguerite got pregnant, and again, similar story to what Aunt Fessler wrote about, her family sent her to live probably with her grandparents in Chicago to have the baby at Mount Sinai Hospital. And then Marguerite lost all touch with the child. And when I was 5 years old, around 5, we moved out to Hoffman Estates, which we all called the Estates. That's a highfalutin name for a blue-collar suburb. It was the kind of place that veterans from World War II in Korea bought their first home. You can see our house down in the lower photo. It was a good place to grow up. And a lot of the stories that are up in my first 2 novels, when I realized my characters needed backstories, tie up to my childhood in Chicago. There's Boyhood Friends, the President of the United States, and a sports radio talk show host in my two novels, who have backstories about their childhood together and some secrets. I don't have any secrets quite as dark or deep as they have in my stories, but still important. In 1970, I went off to college to Western Illinois University. And for those of you who are parents and worried about your kids turning out okay, look at that motley crew in the upper right-hand corner. I'm the then skinny guy in the plaid shirt. And as far as I know, we all turned out okay. So Hoffman Estates was also the place where I learned I was adopted. I was probably about 10 or 11 years old. I remember I was standing in the kitchen, and my mom told me she had read a book in which, I think, or talked to someone about, what's the best age to tell someone that they've been adopted. And she did. And I don't remember it being terribly emotional for me. But again, I think like a lot of guys, you kind of erect the scaffolding around your feelings. And, over the years, as I put so much effort into this, I realized it was much more emotional to me than I was, letting on to myself. The one advantage I had, and I don't remember what age I was when my mother showed me the original adoption papers, is because it was a private adoption, I did know my birth mother's name. I've always known it was Marguerite Dargan, and that my birth name was Michael Joseph Dargan, which sounds, very Irish and all that. And so that was a great starting point to have. But as you will hear, it wasn't terribly advantageous in terms of making it easy. So we're going to fast forward now quite a few years to the 90s, when I started, for whatever reason, to get very interested in figuring this out again. And this is, pre-internet, pre-having access to a lot of the tools that, subsequently proved to be very valuable. And I had been active in the Associated Press, managing editors through my journalism career in Racine, Wisconsin, then Madison, and by now I was the editor and publisher of the York Daily Record in Pennsylvania. And I had met Bob Giles, who was the publisher of the Detroit News, and I kind of leaned on Bob, and then another friend of mine, who was the editor of the paper in Lansing later, to help me locate things. Because one day my mom and dad were visiting, and this was probably about 5 years before my dad passed away, and we had tickets to a Bears-Eagles game in Philadelphia. I'm living, remember, in York, Pennsylvania, and of course I'm a Bears fan, as I should be. And I had tickets from a friend of mine, taking my dad to the game. And so we're on the Pennsylvania Turnpike driving to Philly. And it's a great time to pump him for information. My mom would never talk much about it. And she was a pretty introverted person. My dad was a lot more outgoing. And I said, hey, so what do you know about it? And he told me how they had got me as an infant in a park. Dr. Delson, he believed, was the person who was in charge of the handoff in a park in Chicago on the west side. And I said, well, what do you know about the birth parents? Anything? He said, well, I don't know much, but I think she might have been from Michigan. Oh, okay. Well, that's a start. So I used this was back when newspapers could afford to have full-time librarians and researchers. Bob was very helpful. Had his staff send me, and you look at that old-fashioned computer printout of people named Dargan, obituaries that had run in the Detroit News, and that was my starting point. And what happened as a result was I found that there was, and I'm going to make up some names here because as you will hear, it turned out not to be the right answer. So, but I found out a guy named Richard Dargan, and Richard's not the real first name because it's not fair to this family for me to say otherwise. But I ended up, long story short, in this part of the slide, believing after talking to family members, et cetera, that at first I thought there was a woman named Margaret Dargan who might be my birth mother. And then I realized the woman I was talking to, her late husband, actually had before they were married, had been with a woman named Marguerite in a little area called Holt, Michigan, just south of Lansing. So I really honed in on that to see if I could track down this woman named Marguerite Smith. Smith is not the last name, I'm making that up, but it was a very common last name. So we'll call her Marguerite Smith. And, one of the first things my wife Cheryl said when I got pictures of Mr. Dargan, and she said, he doesn't look like you at all. I go, well, yeah, that happens, and she was right. He really didn't look like me. I finally got a picture with some help from the High School Alumni Association in Holt, Michigan, of Marguerite, and she did look kind of like my daughter to me, and curly hair, lighter colored hair, et cetera, et cetera. And thinking, well, okay. And I learned enough about Mr. Dargan to kind of satisfy my curiosity about him. And but Marguerite was just a mystery. Marguerite Smith was just a mystery. And one of the, when you're searching for women, of course, women get married, they change their names. That makes it harder to find females. And also, the maiden last name was, very common, which, when you're searching for people named, Smith, Anderson, Adams, whatever, I mean, it's very, the line is long that you're checking. And over the years, I actually worked with a private investigator. I did a ton of searching. I could show you stacks of papers about like this to try to figure out this Michigan connection. So it's fair to say the frustration grew. This is a 1930s census record, the kind of stuff you can find on Ancestry and other databases that shows where Marguerite and her family were in the 30s. And I was tried to track down the children of Mr. Dargan. Learned a little bit, but again, I kind of got to the point where I knew his story, so I felt like, well, okay, if that's all I'm gonna know, that's okay. But I was really kind of frustrated by being able to know so little. She just has this baby. I actually talked to someone once who was from Holt, who described Marguerite having a child right at about the same time I would have been born, and then she just sort of disappears, and no one knew what happened to her. So the frustration grew, needless to say. So I joined Ancestry around 2003, but the DNA tests weren't, you could do a lot of research in the Ancestry, but it was too soon to do the DNA testing. Eventually I did do the DNA testing, and as the story goes, Cheryl, my wife, and I are in Dallas one day visiting my oldest son, John, and his wife, Sarah. And that happens to be my DNA results come back. And I think I'm going to see, well, Irish and British and Western European, because I think I know everything, you know, at least the basics about, you know, my birth parents from Michigan. And I am 50% Jewish. And the part that isn't Jewish is Eastern European and Russian. And as you can see on the ancestry, you know, map there, there's nothing in Ireland at all. So whoops. Now my daughter-in-law is Jewish. Sarah's Jewish, and of course, and a witty attorney indeed. So Sarah's comment was, "Hey, welcome to the tribe," and I was pleased to be welcomed to it. But you know, it was kind of like the old Firesign Theater album, "Everything You Know Is Wrong." So you know, I had to kind of start over in my search. And then John, but I should add, sent in his DNA as sort of a confirmation, because again, this was my first experience with DNA testing. And of course, his came back 25% Jewish because my wife is not. And it also validated my DNA, as all the subsequent DNA tests I've been involved with different relatives have also proven to be the case. So, you know, that's really the day when everything changed. So I really thought long and hard about putting this slide in. It's pretty personal, but I can't tell the story without putting this slide in. My dad's ethnic background is a Hungarian, although he was Christian, you know, would have fit it. And for a number of things, you know, I won't go into in great detail. I would have explained some things if he was my birth father, and that maybe he was my birth father, but Ruth Hetzel wasn't my birth mother. Plus, everyone kind of saw a resemblance. He's got my squinty eyes and my cleft chin. A very handsome man, 6 feet. He's taller than I am. But people saw resemblances. And, you know, one of the things I learned, and this is a kind of a pro tip, you do have to be really careful about resemblances if you're doing this kind of searching, because we see what we want to see. And sometimes resemblances are helpful, but you can't take that as a resemblance as anything definitive. So if that was true, this theory, that seemed like a good working hypothesis, I'll just leave it at that. And that I was looking for a Jewish birth mother, because everything else sort of fit. And I also knew he had been in Michigan for bowling tournaments and for business over the years. Of course, that also meant he would have had a fling around Thanksgiving of 1951. And my parents, by the way, were married 50 years and stayed together through everything. So I felt guilty for thinking that, but it was something that, you know, I pursued for quite a while. So the first real connection I had in my DNA database was with a wonderful woman named Shirley Shapiro, and she is the distinguished older lady in this photo. And that's where I learned I was in the Deichmann family line, a Jewish family. And Cheryl and I and John and my oldest son John and his wife Sarah and I all went to Phoenix to meet these wonderful, helpful people. And they were, you know, just open about helping me understand how I might, you know, fit into the picture. There was no question I'm somewhere in this family tree with the Deichmanns, of which there were a number of siblings, probably 4 or 5 in the line that would have been Shirley's parents, my grandparents, whoever they were somewhere in this line. And that seemed pretty obvious based on the DNA connections. Over to the right, I kind of show you blurry what a DNA connection looks like in Ancestry. So we came in at about the second cousin level, which is a pretty close match, and you may see some resemblance there. I do, between some of Shirley's children who are standing there with me. So the smart money in the family, as the family became more aware of me, and I want to step back for a second. The way Ancestry and 23andMe and a lot of these databases work in terms of contacting people, because it is a question that you get, is you can email someone within Ancestry, say, who you have a genetic connection to, and just say, hey, I'd like to talk to you. I think we're related, or whatever you want to say. And that's totally up to the other person whether they want to get involved with you or not. And I found in multiple cases, whether I was on Ancestry or calling people on the phone or looking for them on Facebook, I mean, the myriad ways you have to try to find people today, I always would start by saying, look, I know this is going to be weird and on a left field, but I'd like to talk to you about, I think we might be related, and I'm doing some family research that's really important to me. And then I would always add, because of the nature of my career as a journalist and editor and a trade association executive, I've been in the news a lot, I've written a lot. Just punch my name into Google, check me out. I'm not really looking for anything except some help. And I don't blame you for being suspicious about, is this sketchy or what? So I always tried to be very upfront about telling people, check me out first. And if you're comfortable, let me know. And that's worked in every case I can think of. So at any rate, to jump back, the smart money in the family was on someone who would have been Shirley Shapiro's, let's see if I got this right, Shirley's great aunt, a woman named Ida Deichmann, who had disappeared kind of from the family's radar in Chicago. And they kind of knew she had a tough life, but no one knew what happened to Ida. And they figured, well, maybe Ida was, was my grandmother, was probably my grandmother on the Jewish side of my birth. And that was the working theory for quite a while. So to jump back a little bit, as we talk about this genetic research, I finally realized it's really like a game of Mastermind. If you've ever played Mastermind, Mastermind is an elimination game. And the family tree stuff, the DNA stuff, is more about eliminating paths until only one path is left. That's the best way I can describe it. You eliminate all the other possibilities until you find the possibility that explains everything you know. And once there are no other possibilities that explain everything you know, ergo, that's the only possibility that's left. In Mastermind, you're picking out pegs and guessing what the pattern is horizontally. So as you make guesses, your thought process is, well, I know now it can't be blue. I know it can't be green. I know it can't be red. So it must be purple. And that's kind of what happens. So as I honed in on Ida, I kind of had that in the back of my mind. And at this point, no one was suggesting that Nathan Dutch was a likely candidate to be my grandfather. He had changed his name from Deichmann to Dutch after coming to America from Russia or perhaps Poland. And this is according to one of my cousins who's done a lot of family research, Rebecca, who's done a lot of family research, who I think is on this presentation. And he had multiple jobs, married a woman named Rachel Sweet, and had multiple other siblings over the year, although some died very young, and ended up in Madison, Wisconsin. And again, he was among the least likely candidates. And so, we were really focused on connections to Ida. And then, kind of out of the blue, while I'm thinking I'm looking for my birth mother, I find Marguerite. And, if there was an aha moment, a night where I went, holy cow, this was one of the two. And the story behind this is, as I recall, I was on the Mormon Church database, familysearch.org, which is a tremendously helpful database with tons of information. And by then, but by this point, through multiple efforts over the years, if we had more time, I could go into some of the things I did in more detail to try to track down the Marguerite from Michigan, who I thought was my birth mother. And then I started looking around in Chicago a lot, and I never could find a Marguerite Dargan that could fit. It's a rare name. And when I did find someone that was in that ballpark of a name, even, it never fit the other criteria that had to be true. So I got into the point where I was just searching on the name Marguerite, no last name, from Chicago or Lansing, Michigan area, in the likely range of when someone would have been born in order to be my mother in 1952. And a woman, the name Marguerite Istok, I-S-T-O-K, pops up. I'm like, oh, well, it's not Dargan, but whatever. So I go into ancestry.com and I punch it in, and it pops up in one place in a family tree kept by a woman named Amy Dargan Parker, who turns out to be my cousin. And it says Marguerite Istok Dargan Noonan, and that's Marguerite, and everything else fit. And I knew I had found her. That was her. And that was a night where I went running downstairs, kind of tearing up, showed Cheryl immediately. That was pretty crazy. And the interesting thing, Dargan had always been a little bit of a false lead, certainly in terms of my ethnicity, because as I later learned, Marguerite's mother, she was Marguerite Istok, and her mother had remarried a fellow named Dargan. So she took the Dargan name when they moved to the Quad Cities of Illinois and Iowa. She went to Rock Island High School, graduated in 1949 as Marguerite Dargan, but was really Marguerite Istok as a younger girl. And later in life, she married a fellow named James Noonan, and he lived in Texas, where she died in 1998. So I'd missed meeting her by about 20 years. But I had a family. I had some new family members to get to know. And on the far left is my cousin, Joy Harewood, and there's Amy next to Joy. They're both healthcare workers, by the way. They're real heroes. And should all be thanking them for what they do. They were the daughters of Marguerite's brother, who also has passed away. And I heard a lot of stories about it. Marguerite, again, it so parallels a lot of these stories in Ann Fessler's book. Marguerite never had any other children. I was told how she got sad every July, which is my birthday month. And she doted on her nieces and nephews. Apparently she was she was the aunt you went to visit who would let you get away with stuff and do stuff. They had a family cabin up north of Madison in Wisconsin, like a lot of Illinois people, that they all loved going to and visiting. Amy told me a really, really powerful story. Amy's a very spiritual person. And when I surfaced, well, the funniest thing was, first of all, when I surfaced and contacted her first, she said, was kind of surprised that I wasn't African American, because what little Marguerite had said that she knew about was that the child was mixed race. So they kind of thought I might be Black. Well, obviously I am not. But of course, Jewish and Christian would have been seen as mixed race quite readily in the early 1950s. And but Amy said they had her and my Aunt Helene, her mother, had recently been praying for Marguerite's child, me, to surface. I mean, just in those recent weeks before I popped up out of nowhere. So you can read into that what you want, but I think that's a pretty powerful story. Marguerite had some issues, had demons, had sadness. She found a lot of happiness later in life, from what I understand, with Jim Noonan, who also has passed away. She was a vibrant, outgoing person by all accounts, and I'm sure I would have thoroughly enjoyed meeting her and getting to know her. So I'm sad about that, but I'm so appreciative of everything I learned from my new family members and my cousins particularly. We went down to Paxton, Illinois to visit Helene, and I met Joy over in St. Louis, and I've since met Amy in Dallas. So now Helene, my aunt, remembered a remark that she thought Marguerite had made about the birth father perhaps was related to these Jewish movie theater owners in the Quad Cities, which is Moline and Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport and Bettendorf, Iowa, on the Mississippi River. So I started checking into that. I went to the Rock Island Historical Society, and of course, these people live for that kind of request, so they were really helpful. And it turned out I'm not, but I made a lot of new friends. And one of the other things about going through these searches is, I just met a lot of people. I'm friends on Facebook now. a distant relative of one of Barney Brotman, who was a Jewish theater owner in the Quad Cities. I'm a distant relative of Jay Brotman, who's an architect, very successful architect, who I got to know. But I'm not related to the Brotman family in terms of my birth parents. So you just make so many new interesting journeys along the way. But it was it was kind of a blind alley in terms of my birth father, and I still don't know where that connection came from. And we can only speculate, if Marguerite said that, what she thought, or maybe she had had a relationship with more than one man. That certainly those things went on back then too, and we can only speculate. But I did a lot of work trying to understand the life of movie theater owners in the Quad Cities of Illinois along the way. So this is probably the most important slide for those of you interested in genealogical research, because this was the clinching slide in finding my birth father. And at the lower left, and where the arrow that goes up to Nathan Dutch, the arrow that goes up to Nathan Dutch is a woman named Rebecca Yamanaka, who I mentioned earlier, who's sort of the family historian, or one of the family historians. And one day, and I'm over to the right, this is my family tree on Ancestry, and my DNA popped up in 23andMe as a close relative, a surprisingly close relative to Rebecca. And I'm thinking, this doesn't make sense, because once I talked to Rebecca, she is in my kids' generation. She's a little bit older, but she's a generation younger than I am. And one of the things you learn is that, when you're closely related to someone, like at a first, second cousin kind of level, and there's some other factors here too involving intermarriage that even strengthened it, you can't be that many steps away from each other in terms of who your shared relative is. So Rebecca's great-grandfather was Nathan Dutch, who I mentioned earlier. And the only way that Rebecca and I could be that closely related would be if Nathan Dutch was my shared relative too. Nathan Dutch would have been my grandfather. And by this point, I know I'm looking for a male. I'm looking for my birth father. I've discovered the birth mother, and I should add that several of my relatives on Marguerite's side have since done the DNA tests, which further confirm it. There's really no doubt about it. And so Nathan's my grandfather, and Rebecca's DNA test was really the final puzzle piece, and it actually explained everything. It even explained a real crazy thing that happened back when I thought it was might be Ida Deichmann. One day, I find I'm related to a fellow named Jordan Prager in the DNA database. And I say, does the name Ida Deichmann mean anything to you? We seem to be related. And there's this pause, and for the electronic, I think it was an email equivalent of a pause. And it turns out that his father was adopted, and he didn't know a lot about his father, didn't know a lot about it. But Ida was his father's mother. Ida was his grandmother. And I knew at that point that Ida was not my grandmother, because for he and I to share Ida as a grandparent, whether as we would have to be brothers or half brothers. And while we were closely related at sort of a cousin level, we weren't that closely related. So it was very unlikely. So that sort of eliminated Ida, which again, this is how the process works as you're, trying to think through it. So Nathan, fortunately for me, had 3 children, and 2 of them were female, 1 male, and that is Sherman Dutch. So, and if you had asked any of the people in the family who would be among the least likely candidates to be my birth father, Sherman Dutch, I think everyone who's on this session who's part of that family would agree. Sherman would have met Marguerite before he met his wife of many years and had his own family. And I now have I'm an only child, but I now have a half sister and two half brothers. And there's been DNA testing since then by some of these relatives, and everything fits. And as I said earlier, it's the only path you can put me in this family tree where everything fits, that explains everything. If you put me anywhere else in the tree, there's something that doesn't fit, that won't work in terms of what we know about the shared DNA. So now I've connected with my birth father's family, which is, pretty darn cool, pretty exciting. And there's some photos of Sherman up in the upper left, and what I've learned, again, thanks to Rebecca and the other family members, and Shirley Dutch, who's my half sister in the lower left-hand corner with her family, and many others, is, he was in the Air Force in World War II, was part of D-Day invasion, came back, went to the University of Wisconsin, became an accountant for his wife's family business. Was by all accounts a wonderful man, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to meet him. You might be wondering about, what don't I know, what don't we know? The family suspects, and I would tend to agree with this based on what I know, that he probably didn't even know that Marguerite was pregnant. And that would have certainly fit with the narrative in Ann Fessler's book. If he did know, the family's pretty convinced he would have said something to somebody over the years, and he would have been very surprised to know that I existed, but certainly I think would have accepted me, and I really do believe that. So I'm sorry I missed him, but I'm so thrilled to have this new family that I've connected with. That's Rebecca on the left, and the photo in the upper right with her sister, and I thank her so much. And then in the lower right, and I talked about resemblances earlier, and you have to be careful. This is my cousin Carrie Dumont, who I met in Las Vegas, where a lot of my relatives, my cousins, and my Aunt Sylvia, who just passed away at 101 earlier this year. We had a chance to go hiking out on the west side of Vegas, and he's younger and thinner and a little handsomer than I am, but I do think there's some resemblance there, and we really connected. It was really exciting to meet him. So there's a couple other quick stories I just have to tell about some of the two other crazy things that happened. The craziest thing for me personally was the Madison Connection. I always have felt, and you can believe what you want to believe, but I always felt a tug to Madison, beyond the fact that it is a cool place to live. And I was the managing editor of the Capital Times in Madison from 1986 through 1990. And I knew people who I was related to, but I didn't know I was related to them until obviously much later. My boss, Dave Zwiefel, I'm sure knew a lot of my relatives, including a fellow named Marshall Shapiro, who I now know, was a cousin, who passed away recently. He was a well-known figure, kind of a larger-than-life kind of guy in Madison. So that's pretty crazy. In the upper right is the article I wrote for the Tribune. But one of the crazier, most interesting things about how you get on these journeys and you end up linking with other people in this world. In the upper left, that's my sister-in-law, Marcy Lewis, the second from the right. And next to her is a woman named Lisa Schneider, and Marcy's two kids, my nephews, Eamon and Andy. And one day my son John says, "Hey, are you related to a woman named Lisa Schneider in Ancestry?" And I said, "Well, I think there's some Schneiders in there," which there are. I said, "Probably, let me check." And I check, and not there. So I said, well, she's related to you, but not to me. It must be one of Mom's cousins or something. It's got to be on Mom's side. Well, then I remember, as I'm talking to Cheryl, my wife, that and I've talked to Marcy and Lisa about this, about sharing this with you. Marcy had a daughter as a young mom in the late 60s. And had always wondered what had happened to her daughter. And it turned out that Lisa was doing exactly what I was doing on Ancestry, So I might not have this exactly right, but in essence, John and Lisa connected, my son John, and said, I might have some information for you. And this picture is taken in the last couple of years where there's this tremendous reunion. So, it's another example of just the crazy things that can happen when you get on this search. So I have some new family, connected to Lisa. So I have so much to be thankful for. And I just want to show you a couple more pictures. This is Shirley and me at a bar mitzvah in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, that the family was gracious enough to invite to. I want to show my own family up in the upper right, because they've always been there for me, especially Cheryl. And that's Nick, my daughter Lindsay's fiance, on the far left with Lindsay. That's Sarah and John, who you've heard about. And that's my son Nate on the far right. And his fiance, Sarah Goulden, is in the picture only because she wasn't in the picture when that picture was taken. And they're also engaged to be married. And I want to shout out Paul and Ruth one more time, because this is about them too. And they loved me profoundly and deeply. They made their marriage work for 50 some years. And I want to tell you one final little story before we go to questions. On the night my mom died, she had dementia. She was in a home, and I didn't think she was going to pass that night. So I went home. I'm standing in one of our extra bedrooms. This was in Cincinnati when I worked at the Cincinnati Enquirer in like 2008. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, a tap that sort of wasn't a tap. And I'm not making this up. And then there was like a thought bubble in my head. And the thought bubble was, oh my God, the phone's going to ring. And then the phone rang, and it was the hospice saying my mom had passed away. This is a true story. And, Ruth Hetzel was not related to me genetically, but she was very much related to me spiritually. And, what a profound spiritual moment. And I kind of want to close on that note, because I want to make sure that Paul and Ruth, get the attention and respect that they have as I tell you this story. So here's the shameless self-promotion time, because now I've whetted your appetites. For those of you who haven't read my book, certainly you're interested in doing so. So there's a couple ways to check me out. And we're not going to have a lot of time. I'm not going to talk about the stories in the books in the time we have available, but you can go to Amazon or to headlinebooks.com or to my website, dennishetzel.com, and learn more about the books. If you like political thrillers with hopefully good characters and dialogue, they might be a good fit for you. If you go to headlinebooks.com right now, we will arrange to have a book signed and personalized to you with free shipping. The Kindle books are available at Amazon, as well as physical books. You can order direct from me or go to your local bookstore, and most of them can order if not in stock. If for some reason they can't or won't, then let me know, and we'll figure out how to get some books to you. So that's it on behalf of Paul and Ruth and my family and Marguerite and Sherman, who are in this photo here. I thank you.